Hello and welcome to our first Spinal Injuries SMG podcast. I am Alex Payne, a partner here at BLM, and today I am joined by Emily Formby QC from 39 Essex Chambers. Emily, hello, and thank you for joining us on this podcast today.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much indeed for having me.
So in this podcast, we're intending to look into the impact of COVID over the last 2 years on catastrophic injury claims, such as those involving spinal injuries. We're going to chat about the impact on litigation, NHS cover, working from home, and any other areas that occur to us as we're going along. Emily, to kickstart this off, do you think COVID has slowed down progress on civil claims?
Well, gosh, I think that's enough of a question to kind of last for the whole podcast, probably. I think it really depends on the case. I mean, we can see in some areas of law, things like possession actions or whatever, shut down absolutely, completely. And we can see in other areas, such as the TCC, they were rejecting adjournments and holding remote hearings from the middle of March, the end of March on. I think in our field, so in the sort of civil litigation catastrophic injury claim, courts were clearly struggling to cope, and so in some cases ground to a halt. In other cases, they carried on without a lot of hindrance. And I think there are various reasons. Obviously, cases that were lawyers only applications or hearings or directions or so on and so forth, it was much easier to get those online much more quickly. And cases with experts, sometimes it was impossible to have experts because they're all busy. We tend to have a lot of medical experts in catastrophic injuries, and they were all busy working the pandemic, and also witnesses. It's difficult to have remote hearings without protocols and so on and so forth to be confident that they are going to be fair hearings. And again, witnesses, it will make a difference if they are commercial or professional people, or whether they are, ordinary punters who are going to be working from an office or are going to be, working from their bedroom. So I think that those were some of the factors that affected court a lot. And also in terms of progressing cases, being able to be assessed by experts or being seen by people, and lots of claimant shielding, lots of people shielding, and often those that are catastrophically injured will have vulnerabilities that will, I think a lot of those claimants were naturally shielding anyway, whereas perhaps in other areas of law they weren't so much.
Yes, certainly from my experience, what I noticed was that some solicitors seem to be more prepared to engage in pathway meetings and work collaboratively between themselves in the absence of a formal court timetable. Perhaps sometimes we would wait for the CCMC and get those directions and work to those, whereas there seems to be more cases where we were working outside of that, perhaps more than they were doing before lockdown. We've all probably experienced the difficulties that the courts were having with backlogs. That's been my experience as well. I haven't noticed that arranging virtual JSMs has ended up slowing down our ability to resolve cases, as you say, if they're ready to be resolved. I mean, interestingly, what I've not seen is an increase in settlements involving PPOs. Claimants still seem to prefer lump sum awards so that they've got the control over the funds to do with as they wish. And insurers have always preferred the certainty, in my experience. However, I'm wondering if certain claimants may see COVID as a life limiting factor and prefer the security of annual payments, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very interesting, the extent to which there will be a long-term effect on life expectancy because of COVID. I mean, just now, the 6th of October 2021, the Longevity Science Panel have published some UK-based data, and that does suggest there's an impact of COVID-19 on life expectancy because of the excess mortality. So the life expectancy at birth for men or for male babies has fallen by 1.3 years and for women by 0.9 in 2020. Now, that's also pegged to ethnicity and social deprivation, as we've seen in the death rates as they've unfolded. What's interesting is to how that is a short, sharp shock, or whether that's something that will continue with, long COVID or those kinds of issues. And I would have thought that is somewhere where you may see an increase in PPOs going forward, if it's being argued that your life expectancy will, undoubtedly be affected because of COVID or because of long COVID. The data set is still relatively small. The disease is very young, and it's hard to know what's going to happen to people with long COVID as things unfold. And so an answer to that may be to say, well, okay, well, I'll have a PPO instead, please, because then, the data set may be right or it may be wrong, but we don't have to determine that now.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, when COVID cases started rising, I'm moving on to NHS cover now. The NHS decision was to prioritise cases on an emergency basis, and we've probably yet to see the full impact of this. But do we expect to see claims coming out of these delays and continuing delays? Because we're still seeing hospitals struggling to cope with the pressures from COVID. Cases are rising again, and routine surgeries are still being cancelled even now.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, obviously, we know in terms of actually sort of treating the illness or managing the immediate situation. From the 2nd of April 2020, there was the clinical negligence indemnity for liabilities arising from healthcare workers and people working in the coronavirus response, and also, backfilling other roles. So, the oncologist who ends up in A&E, and so that indemnity umbrella was there. But I think what's interesting is to look at that sort of response. So on the one hand, you could say, well, yes, there's very obvious, and I know there's a lot of chat in the industry that there's going to be a welter of cases coming down the line of people because they had delayed treatment, because they didn't have treatment they were promised, because they got infections, they blah 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 blah, whatever that may be. I don't mean that disparagingly by saying blah blah blah, but I just mean there are lots of different examples. But at the same time, if your judgment is going to be based on the standard of care, and if actually the reasonable practitioner at that time, everybody was doing exactly the same thing, and all things were halted and all delays were the same, and that becomes the norm of that's the standard of care that was available, then whether or not those cases will fly because there isn't a breach of a standard. We've already started to see some public law challenges. Obviously, that's an arena to sort of examine the decision-making process itself. I mean, there were two very recent judicial reviews. On the 9th of September, there's a judicial review, a permission hearing about mandatory vaccination. Permission hasn't been granted yet, but that's challenging the Department of Health requirement for mandatory care home vaccination. And then there's a claim being brought by a couple of doctors, by two doctors, about their parents being sent to a care home, and the question of the sort of insulating umbrella of care around care homes. And there's, again, permission has been granted on that decision, although there's no decision yet, but that was heard 19th to 22nd of October. Public Health England, NHS England, Secretary of State being questioned there, and of course we're promised the public inquiry. So there clearly will be an examination of the decision process. But litigation itself, I know there's lots of doctors that are concerned about litigation, but it'll be interesting to see how that plans out. I don't know what you're hearing.
Well, I suppose, obviously, my experience is looking at things from large loss cases, and delays of obviously a very hot topic at the moment. But with me, when I was looking during lockdowns, what I started to see were certain cases that involving seriously injured patients that were being very quickly discharged from hospital under the NHS emergency COVID protocols. And under normal circumstances, these patients would have been discharged into specialised rehabilitation units for brain injuries or spinal injuries. They may be unfortunate enough to have both, amputation, whatever. And then instead, these patients would actually be being sent to care homes that were run by nurses and carers, and not necessarily staying under the care of the specialised consultants. I suppose the concern with that is what the long-term impacts of the patients are. But I wonder if that's something that would go so far as to raise a claim, because obviously you've still got the situation that the NHS were doing the best they could with the resources they had at the time, and they were acting in accordance with that protocol.
That's very true. And I suppose also the problem with that is, there's always a reluctance to have a sort of intervening cause if you've got a negligent claim arising, and this is that is just unfortunately the consequence of it. And I mean, whether or not there's a justification for saying actually the defendant ought to step in and say, well, you're not getting the rehabilitation you might have had in the NHS, but look, we can provide private rehabilitation, we can help in that way. Or whether there's a call for the claimant being proactive and saying, well, we need an interim payment to buy in the care and support that would have been provided. But that's very difficult, because I would imagine a lot of those cases, well, obviously if they're on your desk, they're not as yet unknown to the defendant, but a lot of those cases will be people that haven't yet even considered whether or not they have a claim, because they'll be in the first stage of dealing with the catastrophe that has befallen them. That's a very interesting and quite a difficult point to look at, I suspect.
Yeah, if they're in the acute stages of their treatment, then it may be that they've not even got solicitors involved. I think statutory funding may also have been an issue for some patients as well, even where the CCG are involved. Are they actually able to get the right processes in place and make sure they're at the right discharge planning meetings and discharge to the right locations?
Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of discharge meeting going on. There appears to have been a lot of, get people out of these situations to free up the beds for what's coming next.
And I suppose from our perspective, if potential issues are going to arise around that statutory funding, then it might be one where we're looking at getting statutory funding experts involved, because they can help us consider those issues and the appropriateness of where the claimant's been discharged to, and make sure they're getting that level of funding if it's required.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, I suppose as always, it's a matter of looking at the reality of the situation, communicating between the parties, and seeking the relevant expertise to understand the situation that's unfolding. And then if there's a situation where rehabilitation is appropriate or where liability is not an issue, providing early funding by way of interim payment or direct funding to fill whatever that gap may be, to try and ensure there is the best outcome for the claimant, because not only will that be better for them, but that will also ultimately be a more cost-effective way of managing the claim.
Yes, exactly. Working pragmatically with the information that we've got available in a very difficult circumstances. The next thing I wanted to look at briefly was accommodation. There definitely seems to have been a move away from renting of late. I mean, the UK is a property ownership culture anyway, but there are various things. There's this desire for open space and gardens after the exposure to lockdown restrictions. People are working from home more, so there's now this increased desire for home office space. People are trying to move away from flats and apartment blocks after all of the cladding issues. So it's perhaps not all that much of a surprise that we're seeing an increased demand for properties, but that seems to be pushing up property prices. And of course, looking at it from a large loss and catastrophic injury claim perspective, what we seem to be seeing are bigger and bigger interim payment requests to deal with this increasing purchase price of properties. I'm not sure what you've seen on this.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. I mean, obviously from the sort of catastrophic injury point of view, you've often got people who are needing larger properties than that which they had before to accommodate, wheelchairs or hoists and the paraphernalia of catastrophic injuries, extra carers. All of those range of things generally mean you need a larger property with external space in any event. And so, that the kind of nature of the property being sought is probably not different. But if you've got everything being more expensive, then of course the cost of that property will go up. I mean, we've all read the papers, and the extent to which that feeds through to an actual change in the market is sometimes hard to know. But we've all read the papers about the rush to kind of buy these larger properties because people want to move out of cities. Some areas have become much more expensive or become much more overheated, like Cornwall and so forth. And certainly the stamp duty holiday had an effect on purchase prices. And we know the ONS has said that the average house price has now risen to over 270,000. So, of course, properties not globally not globally, not nationally, getting cheaper, and so that will concomitantly mean the cost for those that are paying for accommodation for the catastrophically injured will rise. And of course, we've also got feeding through after the hiatus created by Swift and Carpenter, or rather the hiatus created by the negative discount rate, and what that did to accommodation claims before Swift and Carpenter is probably the better way of looking at it. That's affected or distorted those elements of claim for a few years. And now that we know that the calculation is going to reflect the reversionary interest, then the sort of accommodation claim is back up and running, so to speak, and becoming ever more expensive. So I certainly see movement in that area. But again, I think it comes back to getting proper expert evidence on understanding the needs of the claimant and then the cost of the accommodation that they're going to be requiring, and that's just becoming more important than ever.
Yeah, having that input from accommodation experts when you get these interim payment requests through will certainly make it easier to value the claim and get your instructions from your client. We touched briefly on this beforehand, but when talking about the impact of COVID, it is very hard not to look at life expectancy. The courts haven't been overly keen on allowing permission for life expectancy of late, but do we think this is something that we can be arguing that COVID warrants involving this specialism?
Well, I think as we touched on when we were looking at PPOs and looking at the valuation of future claims, it is so hard at the moment to know what that long tail effect is going to be. As I said, as you said when we were chatting earlier, we know that there has been an effect on mortality rate in 2020 from the immediate pandemic, but going forward, whether with better treatments, with vaccinations, that's going to end up being a long-term step change in life expectancy or not is hard to say. And of course, the data set is at the moment still very small. So I think that's something that one's going to have to watch and wait. And I think it would be a relatively bold claim to say that we know there's going to be a shift in life expectancy forever going forward. But clearly there's concerns. I mean, we've got the vaccinations coming out, and that seemed as if that would end everything. But now we're in the world of boosters, and we've already seen that France is saying if you're over 65, you can't come to France unless you can prove not just double vaccination but a booster. We know that there's always concerns about new variants coming forward. Austria's locking people up that haven't had their vaccinations because they said they've got a woefully reduced rate of cover at 60-something%. So I think it's hard to say how it's going to flow through the population going forward. We just have to wait and see.
Watch this space moment. I suppose,
yes.
I suppose what I'm thinking is, if maybe not on a general basis, I expect that it will be one of those things we live with, and the calculations or life expectancy will already reflect it in the same way that we look at smoking. But I'm thinking more where you've got a case where a claimant has had long COVID and perhaps is still suffering with significant effects from that, such as lung damage, then they may be cases where life expectancy would be appropriate. Although I expect that will all be on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very sensible point, and I think that's about looking at the individual rather than having off the shelf life expectancy evidence. It'll be your respiratory expert or whoever it is giving an opinion on that outcome for that individual person. But as we said before, if it does seem to be argued on a more general basis, that may be a reason for increasing PPOs.
Fab. Emily, thank you for your time on this. It's been very interesting to get your insight and experience, and I'm sure our listeners have found it useful as well. It'd be great to hear any observations or comments on the content of this episode, as well as get any suggestions for topics that people may be interested in us covering. For the time being, thank you for listening to our conversation today, and we hope you tune into the next episode from BLM Spinal SMG, which will likely land at some point next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a real pleasure. The time has flown, but it's been lovely to chat. Bye-bye.